Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully we got through our first 13 slides in our original lecture on Monday. So that was my plan, so we're starting from slide 14. Now, as you recall, and I talked about this a little bit in our lecture, Chapter 1 is huge. Chapter 1 is, again, an overview, and we're going to dig much deeper in detail into each of these areas as we go throughout the semester. But you still need to kind of understand these foundational ideas as we move forward. So, we're talking now about qualitative versus quantitative research, right? What are the basic differences? When I think about quantitative research, I'm thinking about numbers, quantity, right? So I'm thinking about things that can be turned into numbers. Often, quantitative starts with a hypothesis. It doesn't have to, but it can. So that hypothesis might be that if we have X intervention, let's say that intervention is I'm giving somebody a diet pill, right? Then those that have that pill will lose more weight than those that do not. Now, I know diet pill is not a great example, but that's the concept, right? Along with quantitative, we're looking at statistics. So we're turning information into data, into statistics, into numbers. So we can do that through actual numbers, right? Think about BMI, think about weight, think about blood pressure. All of those would be easy numbers, right? Somebody's age, we'll talk about these later on. But I can also turn questions into numbers, if you will. So we'll talk later about the Likert scale. If I say, how do you like XYZ on a scale of 1 to 5, right? I can turn that like from 1 to 5 into numbers, therefore into data that I can use later on for my statistics. When we think about quantitative data, it focuses on describing and testing relationships among variables. Did this intervention result in a particular outcome, right? Or if we're not talking about an intervention, do high sugar sodas lead to diabetes, right? Is there a correlation? So these are things we might be looking at with quantitative data. Qualitative, on the other hand, there is never a hypothesis in qualitative data. It's usually not statistically driven. There are very few numbers when we look at qualitative data. We're focused on words, on stories, on experiences. Now, depending on the researchers that you've talked to, I've talked to researchers that are very quantitative, right? That is all that matters is because I have data that is numbers driven. Qualitative is also data, and I want to really impress that upon you. It's just a different type of data. It may not be tied to a hypothesis, but it helps us to better understand the experiences of people, and it can help us as we really interpret some of the quantitative data that we might have. We'll talk about that as we move forward a little bit. So this is from your book, right? Comparing quantitative, qualitative data. The researcher's focus. In quantitative data, we're describing and testing relationships among variables. We're examining a cause and effect, right? We're making predictions. This is what happens, and I've got the data, I've got the numbers to verify what I'm trying to prove or to verify that it's not actually true. My reasoning in quantitative is very deductive. If this, then that, right? My setting is typically very controlled, and we'll talk later about how we might set up experiments where you have a control group and we've got the group that's going to have the intervention, right? And when we sample, it's often a random sample, okay? So we're trying to collect people from different lifestyles potentially, right? From different areas, different age groups. Now, when we do that, we need larger sample sizes, right? So that we're trying to have a sample that is representative of the community that we're trying to better understand. When we look at qualitative, all right, our researchers' focus is going to provide details about human behavior, emotion, personality, interactions, okay? So we're going to formulate a theory or hypothesis after we collect the data because we're trying to better understand the lived experiences of the individuals that are going through whatever it is potentially that we're looking for in the quantitative data. The reasoning is a little more inductive when we're talking about qualitative data. Now, your book tells us that subjectivity is expected. I'm going to push back on that a little bit. I would say that there may be times when we choose to be somewhat subjective. And when we get to qualitative research, I'll talk a little bit about how we might use particular lenses that we're looking through. If I'm doing my research through the lens of queer theory, if I'm doing my research through social justice theory lens, if I'm doing my research through a lens of feminist theory, then absolutely there is going to be a level of subjectivity. However, I should be able to bracket and take out my expectations in the process so that I should be as objective as possible in terms of what the data, how the data is collected and what the data is telling me. The settings for qualitative data is a little bit more natural. You might meet someone in their home in order to do an interview, whereas in a quantitative setting, you would never meet them in their home. You would have them come to the hospital. You'd have them come to the clinic, right? Does that make sense? And in the sampling for qualitative is often non-random, meaning we are trying to find those that have a similar lived experience. We'll talk later about a case study, right? If we're doing a case study, a qualitative case study, then everybody works in the same building, goes to the same college, right? They're part of a particular group, so it's not as random as we might look at in terms of our quantitative. When we look at our methodologies, for our quantitative research, we're looking at experimental or quasi-experimental designs to test for differences, right? We have a fixed design and it's very specific what we're going to do. Our data analysis is numbers-based, right? It's statistical analysis. I already gave you the example. We can use a Likert scale to do a survey to see what level of pain, how do you feel about, right? All of those things, if I can put it in a 1 through 5 scale, I can turn that into a number, and therefore I can use that number to run statistical analysis. My study is validated in quantitative when I think about I'm striving for rigor, for reliability, and for validity. What that means is when I talk about validity for a quantitative study, it means another researcher can follow the directions and come up with the same outcomes, right? So if I do the same study the same way with the same protocols, I will get the same outcome. That's the validity of a quantitative study. And it tends to be very generalizable because we are often using a much larger population. When we look at the number of people in our quantitative study, we might be talking about hundreds, we might be talking about thousands. So that larger population is going to give us a more generalizable study. In qualitative research, right, our methods, they explore and describe like focus groups, observations, semi-structured interviews, right? So the design can be more flexible. I say it can be. I would encourage researchers who are doing qualitative research to be very specific and intentional in their design. And there are a number of designs available to us that are going to make sure that our outcome is more trustworthy, right? When we talk about, you drop down to the bottom here, study validations, we talk about validity for quantitative, but we talk about trustworthiness. Is it good information when we do qualitative? When we look at the data, our qualitative data is words, it's text-based, it's images. We use the term coding. We code to find categories or similarities and themes between the stories and the data that we get. As a result, because we have smaller populations typically, we're looking at less generalizable in terms of our qualitative data. But that qualitative study can then lead us back to understanding a quantitative study on why things work, on why things don't work, for example. What I mean by that is when we think about doing a study on weight loss, right? We might know that weight loss is going to be a result of a calorie deficit. So if I eat fewer calories, if I exercise more, I'm going to lose weight. Lots of people know that. That's an easy thing to share. My quantitative data tells me that it works. Why doesn't it work for everyone? This is where my qualitative data starts to come in. To start to interview and talk to people to understand why they don't do what they know they should be doing, and then how do we potentially remove those barriers or help them get beyond those barriers to exercise, to eat better, right? So that's where qualitative data might come into play. Some of our strengths and weaknesses. So strengths of quantitative data, it allows for greater objectivity and control and accuracy, right? You can examine possible causes and test theories or hypotheses. And very importantly, it can be replicated, right? That's the validity behind it. The weaknesses, doesn't work for all phenomena. If it's really hard to explain, if there are lots and lots of variables that we cannot account for, that becomes a challenge, right? There are lots of variables that might impact the ultimate outcomes. So when we think about weight loss, for example, or let's say hypertension, we're thinking about hypertension. The causes of hypertension, there might be more than we can account for in a singular study, right? It has to do with our diet. It has to do with our exercise. It has to do with our stress level. It has to do with our amount of sleep. It may have to do with our age. It may have to do with genetics, right? So there's lots of things. I just listed out, 6 different variables that can impact hypertension. How do I create a quantitative study that takes every single one of those into account and separates them in a way that allows me to focus on a singular or 2 specific items? Does that make sense? So that's where it's a little bit more difficult, right? And it doesn't capture the full breadth of the human experience, which is where that qualitative research comes in, right? That qualitative research provides holistic view and understanding of complex situations. We gain initial insight into new areas of research, and we can generate a theory that we may be able to go back to and create our quantitative research study design that we can then test, okay? So remember, let's go back to that concept. We're going to come back to it again in a little bit, of our scientific method. We've got the theory, we test the theory, we do the research, we're going to go back. It always goes back to starting over. All right, weaknesses of qualitative, it's time consuming to collect and analyze the data. Smaller numbers of participants. It's not generalizable. It can also be very expensive because it is more time consuming. So, qualitative and quantitative research. Both research complement each other because they generate different kinds of knowledge, right? Qualitative provides insight into problems, identifies variables important for future quantitative research, and can help the researchers develop a theory. So that brings us to, what is mixed methods research? You probably figured it out, right? It's both. It's using or creating a research design that utilizes a combination of qualitative and quantitative. And as a researcher, I firmly believe that that is a really ideal method of trying to get a deeper understanding of the research study that you're trying to complete. So as you move forward, looking at next week, for example, next week we're going to start looking at doing our lit review, right? How do we find out about existing research? When we do our initial research, we're trying to understand the body of knowledge that currently exists on a particular topic. To do that, we're going to be looking at previous actual research. And that's going to be available to us through articles. Those could be in newspapers, right? Typically, we're going to talk more next week about peer-reviewed articles. You've probably heard that phrase. When you're doing your initial research survey, you're going to want to look at the types of research that have been done on your topic. So you can look often at a title and determine whether or not that, just by the title, is it qualitative or quantitative, right? So read the title. Sometimes it has the word qualitative. If it relies on focus groups or interviews or observations, it's qualitative. If you see a lot of numerical data, statistics, it's quantitative, right? So pretty straightforward, pretty simple. So think about this. Here's some examples. Is the study qualitative or quantitative? The first one example here, this is the title. A variety of fruits and vegetables is related to a preschooler's overall quality diet score. Qualitative or quantitative? That's right, it's quantitative, because we're talking about a diet quality score. We're talking about numbers. Now, in that initial research, they will tell you how they define that score, but ultimately, it's numbers based. All right. Communication of nutritional care for elderly hospitalized patients, perspectives of RDNs in hospital and nursing homes. Probably qualitative, right? It's the perspectives of those that are interested or involved. The experience of weight management in overweight adolescents, qualitative or quantitative? It's an experience, so it's qualitative. We're understanding the quality of their experience. Processed food consumption and the incidence of hypertension in an Irish cohort. It's going to be quantitative, right? It's incidence. We've got processed food. We know that there's going to be numbers in there, and it says cohort. So when we look at a cohort, we know that there was some experimental or quasi-experimental data that happened. Now, I recognize right now that as you're watching this video, my little picture here is over some of the words. So remember, there is a full copy of this PowerPoint in your Canvas shell. So feel free to look at that, use that, write notes on that as you're moving forward. So just a quick reminder. All right. On Monday, in our first lecture, we talked about completing the scientific method, right? We talked about what that process is. We do this initial research to understand the body of knowledge that currently exists on a topic. Then we create a study design, right, so that we can run the test, so that we can do the research to get the data. So once you've designed the research, then you implement the study, you collect your data and analyze it, and then you interpret your results and draw conclusions, right? As we said, if it's quantitative, it might be more generalizable. If it's qualitative, it might be less generalizable. Once we've done that, we disseminate the findings. That's really important, right? You want to share what you've learned. Publications, presentations, interviews, conferences, posters, all different ways to get that information out to the public so that other researchers can work off of your research as they move the body of knowledge forward on that particular topic. And then this last line, possibly begin again. Almost always, somebody is going to begin again. Okay? We learn a little bit more. There's always more to learn. So as a result of your research or the new research, now what do we need to know that we don't know? And what new do we know that might tweak or change our next study? So we're here with a nutrition lens, thinking about what is nutrition research? What is the purpose of nutrition research? And nutritional research has a couple different purposes. One is to solve nutrition-related problems, right? Those could be a lot of different concerns, right? The issues with processed food and hypertension, processed food and obesity, processed food and heart disease, whatever, high sugar diets. So solving or understanding nutritionally related problems. I go back to thinking about years ago, way back in the 1950s or so, scientists created something called hydrogenated fats, right? Hydrogenated fat was a perfectly logical decision at the time, where we looked at animal fats that had cholesterol and vegetable fats that did not have cholesterol. So if we were to take a vegetable fat and make it solid, because in some cooking methods you require a solid fat, then we eliminate that cholesterol and therefore we have a healthier outcome. Does that make sense? It took us 30 to 40 years to recognize that what we created were trans fats, something else, okay? So we're always doing research to understand what we think we know and what we continue to learn. So I look at that as a nutrition-related problem to recognize what challenges we've created for ourselves. We might improve client outcomes. So when I talk about clients, I might be talking about folks that live in a nursing home. I might be talking about our folks that are in a hospital. Or if you are a personal trainer or a personal dietitian, you might be talking about helping somebody to improve their lifestyle, improve their diet, improve their overall health, right? So improving client outcomes. Another purpose of nutritional research, to provide cost-effective and efficient care for clients, right? That's where I'm looking at hospitals, where I'm looking at nursing homes, healthcare facilities, right? And to serve as a foundation for evidence-based practice. What should people be eating? Okay. We think we know that. We continue to confirm that, right? I'm going to go back to trans fats. We didn't know we created a thing when we thought we were solving the first problem. But when we talk about evidence-based practice, and we'll talk about this in future slides, it can also lead to helping us understand greater community issues. So one of the things we'll talk about more in this class is the concept of a food desert, right? We know people should be eating fresh fruits and vegetables. Many people know they should eat fresh fruits and vegetables, but they don't have the access to them, or they don't have the income to afford them, right? So this research helps us to understand how and where and why, so that we can start to create policies, and public policy comes out of good research. All right, the purpose and examples of research, right? Exploratory, descriptive, analytic, or predictive. We're exploring something new. We're trying to describe something. We're trying to analyze or test the effect of something, or we're trying to predict an outcome, right? So, study examples. Exploratory. Explore the barriers to eating healthy foods for Hispanic women in an urban community, right? It's a beautiful qualitative study to understand that would then lead us towards public policy changes that might help impact that. Descriptive study. Examine the availability and price of low-fat and higher-fat milk in stores across the United States. So it's a descriptive cross-sectional study or correlative design study that's looking at what is available in different regions. An analytic study. Test the effects of high-fiber diet on blood glucose control in people with type 2 diabetes. Okay, so this is going to be a very specific, well-designed quantitative study. We're probably looking at a randomized controlled trial with a cohort study. So when we talk about that, we're probably looking at a group of people with an intervention and a group of folks that we would call the control group, right? So we can see the difference between two groups, the effect of the diet. Predictive, predict the rate of weight loss based on patient characteristics and intervention strategies. So a predictive correlation design strategy here. So we believe that people would lose more weight if they had access to a daily weight loss coach, right? So you take a group that's got the coach, you take a group that doesn't have the coach, and then you see if that changes, and then ultimately you can predict the potential changes based on, in that case, the intervention is the weight loss coach. You could also have an intervention that provides healthy foods directly to somebody's door, right? That would be another example of an intervention where you're changing the diet to help that person. All right, I'm not going to go into detail on this right now. However, as we move through this semester and in the next few weeks, it's going to become important for you to start to understand what our articles are saying and how people got to where they got, right? What was the hypothesis? What did the study do? How was it done? And what was the outcome of the study? So I would encourage you, take a few minutes, turn off this video, go take a look at page 8 in your book, application 1.2, the Swedish mammography cohort. Look at that. There's also, down at the bottom of this, you can link directly to the abstract. Remember, the abstract in any article is going to be an overview of that article. So it should give you the majority of the information that you would need to decide if you need to continue to read the full article. Read the article, read the abstract. What was the purpose of the research? Was it to explore, describe, analyze, or predict? Was it experimental or a cohort study? Why was it an experimental or cohort study? And what did they mean by higher dietary inflammation index scores were associated with all-cause and digestive tract cancer mortality? So I encourage you to stop, Take a look at page 8, see if you can answer those questions. All right, I know like one of you might have stopped. So we're gonna move on. All right, ways to classify research. And again, we're gonna talk more about this as we move forward, but you wanna know these foundational concepts. We classify research that you're gonna read in your articles as primary, secondary, or tertiary. Primary research is an original research study, right? It's a narrative of a single study conducted by the researcher. It's telling you what the background was, what they did, and what the outcomes were. Secondary research is going to be narrative reviews, so summaries or discussions of primary research. And they may pull evidence from more than one researcher. So these can be advantageous as you are trying to get a bigger picture understanding of a particular topic. But as you do a lit review, right, as you're preparing to do your research, you want your research to come primarily from primary sources, right? So in order to do that, if you find good secondary research, I always encourage you, go back to the original article, go back to the original research and read that to confirm that the data or the information listed in the secondary was true. Tertiary research is similar, except now we're one step back from that. Systematic reviews, collecting information from primary and secondary research. So creating narratives and trying to distill this information from multiple sources. Trying to make life easier for you, but not as ideal when you're the researcher. You want to look at the primary research. All right. Application out of your book, right? You're in charge of a nutrition education program that includes cooking classes taught in a farmer's market to SNAP recipients in an urban setting. The purpose of your program is to improve eating habits by helping participants plan, buy, and prepare healthy meals using product from the farmer's market. Your goal: describe one way to evaluate the program using quantitative research methods, and maybe a couple of ways to evaluate it using qualitative research methods. How might that data be different? Take a minute and think about that. What might you do to collect data to help you evaluate the program? You can pause. All right, most of you aren't pausing. So I'm just going to give you some ideas, right? If I was going to evaluate this program, I could send out a survey. I could have a survey that includes a Likert scale, right? 1 through 5. Did you buy products at the farmer's market? Did you return to the farmer's market? Did you cook with the food that you went home? Did you enjoy that food? Did your family enjoy that food? Would you do it again? If you get a good sampling of that, again, that's all data, 1 through 5. Run it through your statistics. You've got great information to evaluate. I can also do more qualitative, where I can ask open-ended questions. What did you make with the food that you bought at the farmer's market or that you received at the farmer's market? Did your family enjoy it? What did they like most? What did they not like? Okay. Which stands would you come back to? What were your favorite foods, right? Having open-ended questions. This could be done on a survey. This could also be done when people return to the farmer's market and you recognize them as return clients, right? So now you can get that one-on-one information. So those are a couple ways that you might look at trying to gather some data. All right. Basic versus applied information. So basic information, the researcher is performed without a specific application in mind and completed for the sake of knowledge alone. We sometimes call this bench research. It's highly controlled in labs. There's a book example on medication on mice, right? So how does saccharin impact the health of a mouse? Great. That's one piece of information. Applied research now moves into a real world problem. And how do we influence or improve a practice, right? The factors associated with weight loss. Those would be examples of basic, starting to know something, but apply it. How do I actually use that later on? There's 4 major types of nutritional research studies: intervention research, outcomes research, epidemiological research and translational research. Okay, not all nutrition studies fall into these categories, and some can fall into more than one. Okay, so just be aware as you read them. Something could be intervention or outcome, and also be translational research. Right. So let's talk a little bit about those. What does that mean? Intervention research. We're looking at clinical trials. Typically, we're looking at an intervention, efficacy studies. Right. Does the intervention work under controlled conditions, like in a hospital? Okay, so this medication in this situation works. Now we go to outcome research, right? Do changes in a client's health quality affect the quality of life? Do they result from health and nutritional care, right? What are the changes that impact? Effectiveness, right? Does the intervention work in the real world? Taking it from intervention to effective. It works in the lab. Does it work in the real world? And then what's the real outcome of that, right? So outcome is both, is it effective, and what is the outcome for the individuals? I think this is a really great example in your book, right? It talks about the chain of outcome results. So how does that move from that theory, that test, right, that study, into how does that change a person's life? So they talk about 12-week group weight management program that leads to knowledge of food choices, right, awareness of eating and cues, self-efficacy, right, increased physical activity. And we put all that under nutrition-related behavior and environmental outcomes. Now we move from those environmental outcomes to food and nutrition intake outcomes. I know what I should be eating. I know my triggers. And as a result, I reduce my energy intake. I reduce my calories, right? I think about healthful eating patterns consistent with the dietary guidelines. So I move from knowledge to utilization. Now, as I'm utilizing, as I'm eating healthier, I get the nutritionally related physical signs and symptoms and outcomes. 12-week weight loss, 12-month weight loss, reduced weight circumference, decreased serum cholesterol. So now my clinical outcomes, improved blood pressure. My cost outcomes, reduced hypertension medication. And my patient outcomes, for me, the individual, increased quality of life and improved self-confidence, right? That all started with understanding weight management, right? So it's a step-by-step process that allows us to explain and understand how ultimately the patient has positive outcomes. All right. Epidemiological research. I mentioned that as one of the types of research that you're often going to see. So it's the discipline within public health that looks at rates of health-related states, such as disease, in different groups and why they occur. It helps to provide information about who has the disease in a population, frequency, and it looks at patterns to provide clues and possible causality, right? So this is the kind of thing we look at in public research, in public health research, where we look at food deserts, where we look at poverty, right? Starting to recognize how poverty and the cost of vegetables is more expensive than processed food, and therefore poverty often leads to poor diets because it's more expensive to eat healthy, right? Which then hopefully leads us to public policy that helps to provide healthier options at lower costs. Does that make sense? So epidemiological research is trying to understand the problems that are ultimately going to lead to solutions, right? So analytical epidemiology digs deeper to determine the strengths of the associations between risk factors and health and the related state. So soda consumption by obese children. Is that causality? In which case we have to prove that, and there are a lot of other factors, or is it just we see that? It may or may not be a cause, but there might be other things in the lifestyle, right, that results in the reason they're drinking sodas also results in eating more processed food, and other things that ultimately relate to or result in obesity, right? So again, understanding why things happen. All right, looking at translational research. We call that bench to bedside to community. So understanding step 1, step 2, step 3. Step 1 is laboratory research, right? It's the mouse. How does the medication impact the mouse? Step 2, so that's bench, bedside. How does the medication impact the person in the hospital? And then community is now that next step, the research practice in community settings. How do we now utilize the medication appropriately, right? Or whatever the item was that we're trying to look at here. So laboratory, clinical, and then community is kind of that process of understanding how we as nutritional researchers are going to make changes in the community and in the big picture. All right. I'm going to let you look in your book and read through this concept of intervention research, outcome research, epidemiological, and translational. So we just talked about it. Here's some really good examples, definitions, and sample trials, right? Sample studies that might help you to better understand what those look like. All right. So looking at those concepts, take just a second and see if you can figure out, based on the title, whether these are intervention, outcome, epidemiological, or translational research. So our first one is the association between inflammatory potential of diet and mortality among women in the Swedish mammography cohort. Right. So the study that we talked about at the beginning of this chapter. Is that intervention, outcome, epidemiological, or translational? It's an association, it's after the fact, it's outcome, right? So we're looking at outcome. The second one, the effective nutrition intervention on food choices of French students in middle school cafeterias using an interactive educational software program. What do you think that is? The effects of nutrition intervention. It's interventional, right? It's right there in the title for us. A couple more. Persistent effects of early infant diet and associative microbiota on juvenile immune systems. Which one? It's going to be epidemiological, right? We're looking at specific populations. And then finally, in hospital, hypoglycemia, effects of treatment protocol on glycemic control and clinical outcomes, right? So that's going to be our translational, clinical outcomes, right? I hope that helps. I know this was a lot for a video lecture. There's a lot in chapter 1, okay? So for this week, make sure that you complete the introductory discussion board, read through the chapter, right? Hopefully this helped you to understand the chapter that you've been reading through, and recognize that there will be a quiz next week on chapter 1. It's 10 points, it's 10 questions. You'll have 10 minutes or less to take that quiz here online, okay? Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to this semester. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your week.